Now, over the past 100-something years, spark plugs do one basic thing in a gasoline engine. They fire the air-fuel mixture, so there's an explosion that pushes the pistons down. Now, the early spark plugs, hey, they didn't fire all that great. The really early ones, you could actually take them apart into different pieces, clean them, fix them, put them back together, and use them over. And after that, for decades and decades, most spark plugs had copper electrodes in them. Copper's a good conductor of electricity, so they would conduct the electricity, make the spark that would fire the gasoline air mixture. But if you know anything about copper, hey, it may conduct electricity quite well, but it's extremely soft. So what happens is, it would wear out in a reasonably short period of time. Back in the day, when I was a young mechanic, hey, you'd be lucky if you got 20,000 miles out of a set of spark plugs. Sometimes we had to change them even closer if it was an engine that was worn and burned some oil. So they didn't last all that long. Then they went to platinum spark plugs, because platinum, hey, it's much harder. It keeps its sharper edge along. And where the spark plugs fire, you want a sharp edge for the spark to fire correctly. Platinum spark plugs can easily last 100,000 miles. And another advantage of the platinum spark plugs is they generally run a little bit hotter than the copper plugs do. So running hotter, they burn the deposits that get on your spark plug off better, so the spark plugs can last a lot longer. Even if your spark's firing right, if it gets clogged up with unburned carbon parts, it won't fire right. But then came iridium spark plugs, the top of the line ones now. Iridium is 6 times harder than platinum, so it lasts even longer. Plus it has a 700-degree hotter melting point than the platinum does. So they can last an awful long time, these iridium spark plugs. I've personally seen some Chevy V8 engines that had 200,000 miles on them, and the iridium plugs had never been changed and it still ran fine. Now, of course, the iridium ones cost more, but hey, the price keeps coming down. Now you can usually get them for $7 or $8 a piece. And there's a big reason that many engines now use iridium plugs from the factory. And that's because they're making spark plugs harder and harder to get to. As an example, this Lexus behind me is a V6. The front 3 cylinders are real easy to get to. They're out in the open, the front 3, simple to get to. But the back 3 are under the intake manifold. And you have to take the intake manifold plenum completely off to get to those 3 spark plugs. It is a gigantic job. And there's many modern engine designs that are even worse than that. Some of them you practically have to pull the engine out of the car to change all the spark plugs. So iridium makes sense. If you can get 200,000 miles out of a set of spark plugs, hey, most people are going to be happy with that. Now the copper, then the platinum, then the iridium, those are the 3 main plugs that go into cars. But there are a bunch of these wild and crazy manufacturers that design plugs that have 4 electrodes or are made out of even different materials, and they claim they boost your horsepower and make you get better gas mileage. Well, stay away from that stuff. It's just nonsense. Now, ages and ages ago, a spark plug design could have made a change, like in the 60s, where you had points and condensers just mechanically opening and closing and firing the spark plugs through the distributor. A lot of those systems didn't have all that much power. And if you replaced the stock spark plug and hose with one that fired better, they would have actually run better. But it's been decades and decades since there's points and condensers. All the systems are electronically controlled now. The stock spark plug that comes with the car is what's designed for the car and will generally work best. Again, it's 94 silica. Hey, it's got electronic ignition in it. The stock Nip and Denso is the best plug for it. It was designed by engineers. It's the right fit. And speaking of the right fit, let me tell you a horror story. Years ago, I had a customer come over with a 300Z Nissan sports car, and it was clacking like mad. And I said, well, when did this start? And the guy said, well, I changed my spark plugs. And right after I changed the spark plugs, it started making all that noise. So I said, okay, let's stop right there. I pulled out one of the spark plugs. I looked at the spark plug, and I could see the top of the spark plug was hitting something. It had metal shiny parts on it where it was wearing. Well, nothing's supposed to touch the top of the spark plug in the engine. I went to my auto parts store and got a set of 6 spark plugs. And I measured them against the spark plug that I'd taken out. Well, it turned out that the spark plugs he installed were like this much higher. Instead of fitting flush like this, they stuck in the engine this much higher. and it was actually hitting the top of the pistons. It turns out he used a discount auto parts store, and the software that they had, strangely enough, was typed up in South Korea. Who knows these days what kind of technology goes on. And one of those guys made a mistake, and they said that these long spark plugs belonged in his car that had shorter spark plugs. They sold him the wrong ones. Now he was extremely lucky because he did it fast and brought it to me, and I put in the right ones, and after about a day of driving the noise went away. So it didn't really seem to have damaged it in the long run, even though that noise was pretty rattling to his peace of mind when he started it up and heard it. So really, you can't beat the stock spark plugs. Always try to get the same exact spark plug the car came with. When you take it out, you can either match the number, this has a big number on it, or at least when they sell it to you, match it up to make sure it's the same size, and that's exactly the same length of threads as your old one, because you don't want one that's too deep that's going to hit the pistons, or one that's too shallow and it won't fire the flame correctly. Engineers spent years refining engine designs, refining the spark plugs that go in them. You're going against all that knowledge if you decide to swap out to a different spark plug. It has to be the right size, and it has to be the correct heat range for normal driving. But that said, there is one exception. You had a car that say came with a platinum spark plug or a copper spark plug, you could upgrade to an iridium spark plug if an iridium spark plug is made that will fit in there. You're not going to get more horsepower, you're not going to get better gas mileage, but you're going to get longer life. Like in that Lexus, it didn't come with iridium plugs, but I put them in because it was such a pain to take that manifold off. I put in iridium spark plugs. Now I have to admit, the platinum spark plugs that I took out of it had nothing wrong with them. I had to take off the valve cover gasket on that side because even though it was a Lexus, things wear out eventually, and it was 16 years old, and the stupid little rubber gasket on the valve cover was leaking oil. I figured as long as I'm taking that manifold off so I could change the valve cover gasket, I'm going to change the spark plugs too. If they make an iridium spark plug that will fit in your engine when you go to an auto parts store and they look it up and you match it with the old one that's the same size, go right ahead and put an iridium version of the original spark plug. But don't think that there's some magic spark plug out there that's going to make your car run better by some crazy design that somebody thinks is going to work inside an engine better than what the engineers designed it for. Paper filters are actually the best because even if it's somewhat dusty, you can always knock the dust off or get a vacuum and suck the dust off. Once they become impregnated with a lot of dirty stuff, you got to replace them. But for overall performance, these paper filters actually are the best of both worlds. So of course you're going to ask, what are the best paper filters? Well, unfortunately it's OEM, the original equipment manufacturer, because they make them so that they filter the best, get the best gas mileage. And here's a comparison to show you what I'm talking about. This is a Toyota OEM air filter. See how many pleats there are? There's a lot of filtration area. And I'm not comparing it to an aftermarket filter that fits the Toyota, but you can see there's much less pleats. There's not as much surface area. It's not going to last as long, and it's not going to filter as well. There often is a reason that the cheaper air filters cost less. There's less material in them. It's often a cheaper material that doesn't filter as well. So really, for the best filter, you want to use OEM filters. Now, you don't have to buy them at the dealer. There's lots of other places that sell them. But you want to make sure that they're quality and they're not a cheaper filter. So what if they cost less if you got to change them all the time? Or if you don't change them, they clog up faster, you get worse gas mileage, and you're wasting money. I mean, really, look at the difference. Here's the original equipment. Here's the aftermarket one. You can see this is going to filter a lot more than this chintzy little thing that hardly has any paper at all in it compared to the factory one. And I know people are going to ask, what about these aftermarket ones like K&N? Look what it says. Designed to increase horsepower and acceleration. Washable, reusable, lifetime product. Now these K&N filters are good filters. They have cloth-based filtering and there's oil in them, so they filter really well. But since they're oil impregnated, a heavy dust will clog them up really fast. Then you got to clean them. Now there's a kit for that. Here it is, but you have to clean it, dry it, oil it, and put it in. And if you put too much oil in it, it can actually ruin your MAF sensor. The MAF sensor, if that oil gets on it, it will burn the MAF sensor out. So it's something you really got to be careful about in those cars. So really, contrary to lots of claims, nothing beats an OEM filter for a lot of filtration area, long life, and quality filtration. Really, there's nothing to beat it on an average car. I'm going to help you answer the question, do I need to change the coolant in my car? And to answer that question correctly, I'll give you a little history lesson. In my grandfather's day, they actually used alcohol mixed with the water to keep it from freezing in the winter. But then when it got above 32 outside, the alcohol would boil off and then the car would overheat because there wasn't enough coolant inside the radiator. So then they came out with first real antifreeze, which was ethylene glycol based, the classical green stuff. But again, in my grandfather's day, they said, oh, that's a permanent antifreeze. You don't have to worry about it like the alcohol boiling off. So they left it in. Well, they found out it wasn't permanent. Over time, it would corrode and it would destroy the engines. So they had to change it every 3 years because the additives would break down. But that was called inorganic acid technology, IAT. But the inorganic acid technology has its downfalls. You still have to change it every 3 years because the additives break down, and being inorganic, it conducts electricity better, and there's galvanic responses inside that eventually it'll start eating up parts of the metal of the car. We started to come out full blast with organic acid technology coolants, which can last 5 years, 150,000 miles, and some of the newer ones can last even longer. The newer oats or organic acid technology coolants, they last longer, they're less corrosive, they're less poisonous to animals if you spill some and they drink it, and it's meant to be changed about every 5 years or 100,000 miles or so. So if you're the type of person that only drives their car 100,000 miles or less and gets rid of it, heck, you don't have to change it at all then. And to finish the history lesson, there's HOT coolants, which stands for hybrid organic acid technology, like this pink Toyota one. These HOT coolants are the creme de la creme. They add silicates to protect the aluminum, which the oats don't have. So it actually is best for modern aluminum-based engines, and some of them you can change them every 7 years or 150,000 miles. Now the reason these HOT coolants can last so long is that they contain less electrically conductive materials than the older coolants did, so it leads to less degradation of the rubber hoses and the metal parts because it doesn't conduct the electricity that the other coolants did. Now this might sound a bit crazy to you, but you can actually get a voltmeter. You can measure the voltage in the coolant in your radiator system. When it gets old and dirty, it will conduct electricity that starts to eat things up, and it can even mess with the computer sensors of your car. And that's why I've gone to this HOT coolant. Not only does it last a long time, but it doesn't conduct electricity all that well, so it doesn't mess with your electrical system, and it doesn't cause any kind of galvanic responses that are going to eat up the aluminum in your engine. But of course, everything eventually breaks down. Even a HOT coolant, they say you should change it every 7 years or 150,000 miles in a lot of these models. Check with your own make and model just to make sure when you have to change it. But you can go a long time before you have to change it in a modern car. And the important thing to remember is, when it is time to change your coolant, use the correct coolant. Now the HOT is the best. So if you want to keep your car lasting the longest, in any car, if you flush the whole system out, you can then replace it with HOT coolant and you'll have the best protection available. But whatever you do, do not mix the inorganic acid, old green stuff, with the organic stuff, or mix the organic stuff with the hybrid organic acid technology. You want to use one type in your car. And like I said, if you flush the whole thing out, then you can use whatever one you want, but the HOTs are the best. They're going to last the longest, so do that. And you might pay an extra $3 or $4 a gallon. What's that to the life of a car? So if you never want to miss another one of my new car repair videos, remember to ring that bell.